started.
Go for it.
Okay. So this is the Rebel Teacher podcast. It's episode 2. If you saw the first episode, I basically read my article about the Rebel Teacher Network and what the Rebel Teacher philosophy is. And today I'm with Lee, and this second episode will just be discussing the first episode and the reading that I did there. So Lee, if you can introduce yourself. Lee is, this is separate from my Talking Teaching podcast, which some people will have watched. Lee is the first person I've had on who I actually know. So Lee and I are good friends. So Lee, if you can introduce yourself a little bit, and we'll get going.
Sure, thank you, Carl. Thank you for having me on. So very short, I'm Lee Darg. I'm from Birmingham in the United Kingdom, and I've been teaching and training for about 20 years now. I've been involved in what we call the third sector, that's charity and NGOs. I'm heavily involved in politics, and I do training in private companies as well, so quite a mix.
Good. So training, you were training when I first met you, so you've been involved in education actually longer than I have, because you were already training then and I was not. You've been training in quite a different context than I have as well. So I'm sure there'll be something interesting there to talk about, whether in this or in future episodes. But I want to spend today's episode, as I said, talking about the reading that I did in the last episode, which was an introduction to this podcast and to the Rebel Teacher Network that this podcast is a part of. You have watched that video, yes, Lee?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
What are your kind of first reactions? What did you think about the concept of the Rebel Teacher? What you got from that article? And you and I have spoken a little bit about it outside of that context as well. So what are your first thoughts about the Rebel Teacher concept?
I think I drew back to the word rebel and tried to figure out what it meant in terms of teaching. Clearly you want a network of us rebels to be coming together, and I think it really goes back to the principles about what a lot of teachers tell me when I sort of talk to them, and trainers and lecturers and instructors and whatever other words we have for them. But the word rebel is almost not true, because most of the people I speak to in teaching and training, they don't really agree with. So here in the UK, GCSEs and A levels as they are, they don't really agree with, waiting 1 or 2 years to do examinations and then sort of saying, well, actually, as a young person, we're now going to give you a B or a 3 or whatever the grading system is of the day. So most people I talk to in the teaching world have been rebels for a long time, but the problem they find is once they're in the system, they can't rebel, because in order to do their job, they've got to award grades and they've got to examinate people, and they've got to, as a friend of mine who works in a local authority says, that the young people are the meat in a sausage machine that gets processed through the machine and plucked out at the other end as a completed object. And so the rebel part really, really infused me, because most teachers I know want to be rebels. They just feel really constrained because of their day job that they have.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, I work in here in Indonesia. It's a much more traditionally formal context. So certainly my direct experience here has been that there are fewer people already in that position, but I also spend a lot of my time speaking with people online from all around the world, and definitely what you're saying there sounds true in a lot of countries, that there are teachers who do already think in this way. They already think quite progressively. They want to see change, but they feel trapped in their position or in their system, and they feel that they can't do much about what they're thinking. Whereas here in Indonesia, which is quite representative of a lot of Southeast Asia, in fact, most of the teachers that I work with, even that's not really the case. They are quite happy doing things the way that they are told to by their system, by their seniors, and the way that things have been done for upwards of 100 years now. And it's much rarer for me here to find teachers who are trying to break out of that. But even for those teachers that, like you've mentioned, who are feeling trapped in a system they already disagree with, there are different levels, I think, to that restriction. And you've already brought up examinations. So the GCSEs and the A levels and whatever other exams there are, both in the UK and around the world, so many different exams that kids have to sit now. There, teachers are quite restricted because, of course, you can't opt out of those, right? So there's not a lot a teacher can do about that. But on a much smaller scale, it's really just the teaching approach that often I would like to see change. So we can't opt out of the exams, and we can't tell the kids, don't worry about the exam. I would really just like to be able to say to my students, look, we all know really that the exam grades aren't that important, and don't worry so much about it. And hey, if you get a low grade, no one really cares. And I actually think that that's kind of true, but it's not true at the moment that it matters. And it matters when they need to go to the next school year. And when they've graduated from school a couple of years down the line, then nobody cares. And as true as that is, that doesn't really help anybody because they still need the grades at the moment that they need the grades. So, but that still, there's a lot that's going on in the classrooms, the way that teachers are teaching, the format of lessons and things like that, that I think can change. And there's a lot of room for flexibility, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my great heroine, no longer with us, unfortunately, Phil Salmon, had a phrase, I'm trying to remember the exact words of, we pretend that we can put students in a classroom and pluck knowledge from a universal pool of reason and just install the knowledge into their empty vessel of heads, and off they go, and now they're learned creatures. And I think interesting maybe at this point to bring in you and I have sort of discussed this many a time, and we largely agree, but there is this debate around vocational and academic education. And I won't speak for you, I'll speak for me here, that certainly I feel that there wasn't a split in the first place, but we also kind of accept that there isn't enough vocational as well. There's this kind of strange parallel thing going on, that they are one and the same, but also at the same time one is getting more prevalence than the other. And I think, in this country, and just winding back to something you said about the practice, so we have a very didactic approach in this country. In the UK, we have, well, more parts of England and Wales really, because we have slightly different governments in different parts of the country over here, but certainly in England and Wales our education system hasn't really changed in the last 250 years in a way. That young people come into a classroom at the age of 8, 9, 10, and then early teenage years, where they're trying to figure out relationships and sex and who they are and what their place in the world is. But by the way, you've got to shut up and sit down and do this work with a pencil, and no internet, no calculators, no talking to each other. It's so obviously out of date. And one of the things we often have to think about is when we talk to employers, because of course it isn't the only goal that education should lead to work, but it's a very good path. And one of the things that employers constantly tell us is that the education system, are sending us people that struggle to think for themselves, or struggle to think outside of a construct. And we want people to come into a workplace and wow us, and be able to lead and inspire, and be able to do unexpected things. And really, the education system, have conditioned them into this meat in the sausage machine that pops out as a sausage at the end. But you can cook a sausage and eat it, and that's the end of it. So I think the two things that we see in this country education for, which I disagree with, are to get a job at the end of it, or to go on to your next qualification. Now, I have a very strong view that education, the learning, it is the value of learning, and that's it. That is the primary. Getting a job is, of course, an absolutely major, brilliant benefit. It's kind of almost a side effect that you want. We often talk about, especially in universities, we want to help people develop critical thinking. You and I, Carl, haven't we? We've discussed this many times before, that if you're trying to develop critical thinking in a 19-year-old, you're probably a bit too late to the game, because by that point you've lost the ability to help them. So I think there's multiple things that we believe education is for. The first, for me, certainly is learning. As the primary, but in this country we have quite a dogmatic approach politically from many political parties. It's across the various spectrums that education is to get a job, or it's to go on to your next qualification. Well, on the getting a job element, the education system we have doesn't properly prepare people for the world of work that we have now. So even on that very limited scope we have, it fails the test instantly.
Yeah.
So, and this is why we need to rebel, because we have a radically, we have a system that's unfit for the world that we live in.
Right, and a purpose that, as you say, it purports to be for. Even that, the idea of getting a job, there is just a very much received and accepted wisdom, let's not call it, that getting a job is based more on the grades that you graduate with rather than the knowledge and the learning that you graduate with, right? So the idea of getting a job as a result of education is...
That's what the education minister will tell you. But yeah.
But there's an entire economy, a grade-based economy that has been set up and that is perpetuated by, I suspect, more the universities than the schools. I think that it's a university economy, and the schools pay into the university economy, and the companies that hire are supposedly withdrawing from that economy, where it is all about getting that piece of paper with that grade. And it is, I think, upheld by a lot of companies, by a lot of recruiters, and the hiring stage at the end of it all are upholding it, because they do still ask for grades and degrees when they ask for your CV. They want to know what degree you hold, and they still place, this degree as a minimum requirement, must have a bachelor's degree in XYZ, must have a minimum of X number of grades. So I mean, it's still being upheld. And so the schools are saying, well, look, it's our job to get those grades, right? It's our job to make sure the kids get the grades that they need to get the job. And there's been, at every stage of that process, the school, the unis, the jobs, sight has been lost of the learning that underlies the grades, right?
Yeah, I think let me just write down university economy. I like that, because it is that drives. Universities absolutely have a fundamental place, mainly for research, I would argue, especially in the world that we live in at the moment. We need scientific research more than ever, and we see, certainly in this country, research grants, university funding in general being hit, and then research being cut further. So we've got a major problem that's going to, I think, really show itself more in sort of 5 years' time or so, because we're not putting the investment in now into things like research. But I like the idea of a university economy, because I mean, there are some jobs. If I go to work in the city, or if I want to be a researcher, the idea that one would have a lower second would be a complete, who do you think you are coming into my interview room? Ignoring all of the other skills they have. But I would sort of question your note about what businesses still look for, in terms of, do they really look at the grades and so on? Because I go back to your earlier point, actually, about the grades are really only worth something at the time they're worth.
Right.
I remember when I passed all my GCSEs, but every single one of them was a C. And at the time, I was expected to get a half B's and half C's, and I thought, oh my God, the world had collapsed. It was the end of everything. Since then, I've done lots in work. I'm done teaching. I've got a degree in so on from the Open University. So even there, that's a slightly different path. But at the time, I was devastated, and the next morning they didn't matter. I mean, in this country, it's even the case that GCSEs themselves technically only have a 10-year shelf life. So if you go in at age 27 to a job and say, I've got a grade A star or a 1 or whatever we call it these days in English literature and English language, why we separate them, that's another podcast. But that doesn't technically mean anything because they've expired. But even at the age of 17, 18, 19, I don't know of business leaders that interview people on the basis of, have you got these particular grades?
Now, do you think that that's true even when it's your, because if that's the case, then that's very heartening, because it means I'm mistaken about, and now again, I know that is the case, unfortunately, here in Indonesia, but I was quite convinced that was the case in the UK. But I wonder, do you think that that's true for first job applicants as well, when they've just left school or they've just left uni and they're applying for their first job? Because I know if you've already had a job for a few years and you're looking to change, then the recruitment process is going to be much more interested in your performance at your last job. Absolutely. But if this is your first job, is that still the case?
Depends on the sector. It depends on what industry you're in, because of course the the what we call unskilled sectors, which I think is actually the wrong term, because to get into those sectors, such as construction work and manual labour,
It's
you
very
need
skill
lots of
based. Yeah.
skills
Right.
and
Yeah.
qualifications and so on. So I think we're in a transition phase, because the business leaders, to use a very nebulous phrase, but the business leaders will tell us. And just to clarify there, actually, who do I mean by us? So the schools and colleges and universities in the area, those of us involved in politics and making policy for government and local authorities, those of us in those sorts of worlds, and much of that overlaps. The business leaders tell us that they don't just want people coming out with A stars, because not only are they on the rise, and we have more of them than ever, it just becomes it becomes a bit of a race that people have already becomes a race of a number of people where everybody is coming first. So how on earth do you pick?
Yeah, but also, I mean,
go
ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that what they're selling us is that what they want to do is that they want people to come in and sort of wow them. Do they have a good sense of humor? Can they answer some critical questions? Can they get involved in a conversation? The only problem I have with that is then that if you've got somebody with challenges in, disability or neurodiverse, or someone who just genuinely is quite shy, they can't go in and do that. So they're now losing, because we put them in a hierarchy of social characteristics. So we're swapping.
Yeah, I mean, although I would want to argue there's a lot there. There's a few things I would want to argue there. I mean, I agree with you that what we don't want is to take out a hierarchy of grades and replace it with discrimination, right? Of course. But I do think that there would be some jobs, not every job. If you're saying, we've got a data entry job for you, and we hope you've got a good sense of humor, then I don't know the relevance. But I mean, if you're in, to pick one off the top of my head,
data entry before,
right, may or may not be the best example, but something like marketing, something like sales, where the human interaction part of that is central to the job, then some kind of interpersonal skill would, I think, be required. And if you happen to be, I mean, I'm not a particularly sociable person, and so I wouldn't apply for a job in sales, for example. And I think that it's fair sometimes to, there's some form of discrimination. I mean, when we use that word outside of the personal sphere, when we talk about any other kind of object, you discriminate just means to see the differences and decide what's more appropriate. And I think that some form of, kind of neutral discrimination in some jobs is and I would rather see people being discriminated on their strengths and weaknesses in spheres like that than the grades they got when they sat a 1-hour exam at the end of 12 years of study.
Yeah, I think it's interesting on the discrimination point, because what we're seeing, we kind of go, if I describe it as a pendulum, we kind of have a social attitude here, and then it kind of goes here, where ideally we'd want to be here, but the problem is it's either there or there. And what we have with discrimination at the moment is we have, of course, dreadful discrimination. We see a lot of protests, Black Lives Matters and other things, the Me Too movement, all those sorts of things, which I think are actually positive, because those people who still face the more hurdles than the likes of you and I do, it's right to highlight those. And then there are those people who say, well, actually, positive discrimination is just as bad as negative discrimination. But I don't think it is, because without some positive discrimination in those areas, we're never going to see any progress. But also it's the case, I mean, I was talking to somebody who's a recruitment officer for a company based in London, but they are national in Britain. And they only hire people who have identified or been diagnosed as autistic.
Right.
And I was like, wow, that's quite a discrimination, because normally these people, people with autism and so on, would be seen as not useful in certain jobs and so on, which is obviously awful as a blanket. They've gone down the discrimination because their only recruitment they do is in the field of a particular type of computer coding that requires a single focus mind to be able to do the work that they do. And I think so I think in terms of education, those people, those with autism or other what we call SEN in this country, or all sorts of special needs, they are often seen as a problem. They're seen as oh, well, they can't do what the rest of us do. Well, actually, no, they can do just as good, but just in a different field. And
Yeah.
I think so. I think the discrimination word, which I know you've just sort of brought in there as part of the discussion, I think that's really important, because there are some areas where discrimination positively is a good thing, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I suppose just thinking partly about the example you've just raised, but also just more broadly, the kind of logical opposite of any discrimination at all. If you were to remove any form of discrimination, then your only remaining recourse would be to give the job to the first person that walks through the door, and then if they turn out to not be very good at the job, you have to fire them and start again, right? Now, I think to some extent, that using that as an extreme, I think to some extent, one thing that I would like to see more of, and this I would see it as being maybe incorporated into some form of an internship or apprenticeship model, which is, I think, all but dead in most spheres now, where it used to be the standard, would be more of just giving someone a chance, right? Just just say, look, your CV may or may not be the strongest, your grades may or may not be the strongest, these strengths and weaknesses may or may not apply to you, but, we're going to give you a go, and we will be training you as you go, and some form of probation, some form of an apprenticeship period, and if you don't manage to achieve certain goals during that time, then I guess you're not fit for the job. But if you do, then great, and we won't know until a certain period of time has passed and you have demonstrated that you can do this job. Because sometimes you get somebody with the 2-2 and the the glowing CV, and they just can't do the job, but you've already given them the job and you can't fire them now because the law says so, or whatever else.
Exactly.
So I think giving somebody a chance is whatever form that takes. I think giving a chance to somebody who may or may not have all of the prerequisites, everybody would benefit from, the employer and of course the employee.
And I think that's really important, because so there's a couple of threads there. One of the things I would say about the approach of apprenticeships, now in this country, the sort of politics I've been involved with has seen a bit of a renaissance in terms of apprenticeships over the last almost decade, in a way, in that they've been seen as something valuable. I still have a problem, which is a sort of a separate issue. I still genuinely have a problem with, well, why should we pay an 18-year-old less on the minimum wage than somebody older starting the job at the same time? And so there's some issues with how we bring them into the workplace, but certainly in terms of the apprenticeships, it's great if you can get an apprentice to come in to be able to go around different parts of a business, or different parts of this week you'll work in HR, this week you'll work with the trainers, this week you'll work on the shop floor. Those because that actually mirrors the world of work. It is, even older than people older than I would remember jobs, jobs for life. Or if you were to lose a job, you could finish a job on a Friday and walk into another one on a Monday. Now, that's not a world I've generally been aware of, but it was certainly my parents' generation. The generation kind of after me, as it were, absolutely do not have those opportunities. So allowing people to go around and pick up different skills in different teams and in different disciplines, in different departments, mirrors the world of work, where you can have people sometimes holding 2 jobs in different sectors. It mirrors the world of work, because you might have 3 different jobs within 4 months. And that's just how things are now. So, and again, we go back to the education system we have still tries to think, careers advice. What an awful thing we have in this country, careers advice. Okay, at the age of 14, you now tell me what you want to do for the rest of your life. Now, not only is that a ridiculous question to ask a 14-year-old, the idea that then if you were to achieve that at age 18, we have legal requirement to be in education and training or apprenticeships until 18 now, rather than 16, that somehow at 18, once you get into that job, that you'll be there forever. Well, it's just not. It's just not a valid way of looking at the world. And so that side of things is important. But also, you were talking about how we view. We were talking earlier about how we view, and I'm going to look this right back to now, about how we view teaching as a model, and how we teach them in the classroom to start with. Before they even get to the point of, well, what do you want to do for the rest of your life? And I think if you have a system, which we do have in this country, whereby you have a child that sits in a particular chair, usually the same chair every time, and usually away from each other, not allowed to look at the internet, and all those sorts of things that we put restrictions on. And then the teacher talks to them from the front of the class, and they will kind of do what they're told. I suppose the link I'm trying to make is, how do we get those people to come into a workplace and make a name for themselves?
Right.
How do we
Which
get
I think,
those people to come in and say, I'm going to have I'm going to really do what I want to do and achieve something? Well, really, I need to sit back and be told what to do.
Yeah.
How do we square that circle?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a historical element to that. There's often some debate, and I'm not really sure where the historical facts actually lie here, but there's some debate around this this idea that education, when in its first iteration, the kind of formal education system was designed around the factory model. Now, some people kind of hold that idea very firm and use it as a rallying call. A lot of people want to disagree that that's even the case. Whether or not education itself was designed around the manufacturing model, it was certainly designed to populate the manufacturing companies, right? So it was designed to put people into those jobs. And essentially, primary, secondary education was for that, and then the university was for the upper tier of employment. So if you're going to be engineers or upper management, then you would go to university. So we had that model, and it's still basically the same in terms of how it's implemented, which is perhaps why more and more degrees are required, because, well, the degree is for that level of job, and we want people to be moving into those levels of work. But you do end up with basically a school system that is designed and implemented specifically to create followers, right? To graduate followers who will do as they're told, who will kind of sit in the same place all day. And that used to be the majority of jobs, right? Most people would come out of school, if they went to school. If they didn't go to school, it's because they were already in agriculture and they were doing some kind of village position or family thing, and they just were uneducated, entirely uneducated. If they wanted a job, it would probably be a factory type job, some kind of menial labor job, which the school model set them up very well for. Now those jobs are being replaced at a at a very high rate with automation and various other time-saving and money-saving models. That there are fewer and fewer jobs that require you to come into work in the morning, be given, be handed your set of instructions, sit at your post, not speak to anybody else, follow your instructions. You'll get an hour at break, just like you get an hour at break in school, and then you'll go back and you'll continue in your post. Now, more and more workplaces are kind of open plan, they're collaborative, you're expected to work on a team, you're expected to start your own projects, you're expected to come in and not necessarily be given instructions, but know that you have a goal to work towards and work out how you're going to get all of these things that the workplaces are kind of transforming into. Now, school is not supplying the kinds of workers that they need in those kinds of workspaces.
Well, I suppose to bring it even more close to where we are now. I mean, interesting you talk about the history of we devised the education system we have, which is largely seen as academic, to fulfill a factory role, which is seen as vocational. So what a weird kind of transition that is. How about we bring it back up to date? Because you're right to say that, the open plan offices and the way that we want people to try and work together more collaboratively. But maybe we could say that was February of 2020. Where are we now in August of 2020?
Yeah, right.
We're in a world of online. We're in a world of asking people to socialize in the workplace via online apps and video conferencing or phone calls. We're asking people to work more at home. So it's really interesting that we've kind of been forced into this change, which I find, and you and I have discussed this before, where we're begrudgingly trying to find what we're calling a new normal when we should ditch the idea of normal. We can't do normal anymore. Let's use the opportunity to, in terms of education, and where, the theme here is about being rebels. Let's use the opportunity of a new world that can no longer operate the way we did in February of 2020. Let's look at, how can we make online collaboration work? So we've talked often about how, what you shouldn't ever do with online training or e-learning is use it to replace, in
the same practices, the same approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. But we're now in a place that it's just not feasible or even safe in some places for, let's say, at least the next 6 months, to have a massive group of people within one lecture theatre in a university. How are universities going to handle it? Because you talk about the university economy, which I agree with. but they need 150 students sat in a
Well, they
lecture
do,
hall.
but
They
there's an
can't do
irony
that.
there. There's an irony there because actually, what happens in a university lecture hall um, is the is precisely the kind of thing that does not need to be in a university lecture hall, because it's, you know, you and I are in different countries right now, but if we want to sit in silence and watch the same video for the next 20 minutes, we could do that. We don't need to be in the same room to do that. And so to the extent that, you know, the lecture hall is a lecturer lecturing to a room full of people, well, there's absolutely no reason why that needs to be in the room. What needs to be in a room, and I, you know, I still am, I still very much endorse the physical classroom, and I'm quite keen to get back to it. But I hope that when we get back en masse, we'll do things quite differently. One of the things that I think the physical room is necessary for is, you know, good interpersonal collaborative work. Again, there are options for that online, and you can do a lot of collaborative work online, and you can do it asynchronously, which I think there's a lot of value to. But I do think there's a lot of value to having people in the same room, discussing things, sharing ideas, exploring ideas. You can do a lot of that online, but I think that...
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would challenge you on that, only because, so we're thinking, you know, what should we rebel against the system, and what parts of it, and how do we rebel? But if I mean, you have just said, so you're wanting us to go back to the classroom, and I completely agree that there are benefits to that kind of interpersonal relationship. I have a slightly different view on how beneficial it is to be in person talking to somebody about something compared to on a phone or on a conference call or on a video call. I don't actually think there is that much of a difference. But that aside, you're wanting us to go back to the classroom, but we're also trying to rebel against the classroom as a model for teaching. So how do we?
Yeah, I don't know
how
that
do we
I
put
don't know
those
that I
together?
necessarily am. Although I'm open to you know, seeing how far that idea can be pushed, and whether I can go even more in that direction than I already am. I'm certainly open to that. But as I said, but I am not necessarily rebelling against the classroom as a concept. I quite like the classroom. I just don't like what a lot of teachers do in the classroom. So to say, I mean, the extreme example being the lecture. I don't like that. I
The
don't mind
rows of,
having,
yeah.
right. So I don't mind having you know, a number of students in a room. I don't want to have 100 students sitting in rows while they listen to one person speaking. I don't think there's any value to that. But I do think there's value to having, you know, maybe 10 or 15 people in a room, collaborating, sharing ideas on a common workspace. I also think that as technology develops more and more, then I will become less and less enamored by the classroom model. At the moment, I think we're not quite there yet. There are common spaces, you know, you can have shared documents and shared whiteboards online, and the camera. I mean, if we were doing this 10 years ago, imagine trying to do this just over the phone, where, you know, you can only have one person on. The fact that you can now have 10 people on a video call with faces is vastly different than it was just 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. So 5 years from now, if there can be, you know, presumably even more flexibility, then perhaps I'll be even less interested in the classroom.
So would you
then,
say
you
in
know?
the classroom, you know, you're able to see people, let's say the 15 that you've picked, you know,
Yeah,
and then you want to do an exercise, and you break those 15 out into 3 groups of
right,
5, and you can give
right.
them things to do, but you can do all that on Zoom. So why do you need the
You
classroom?
can, as I said, for me, and I'm willing to be just wrong about this, because the wronger I am about this, I think the better. but at the moment, I still feel that there's less fluidity when you're doing it online. I mean, you and I having this conversation now, and I've been having conversations like this for a few weeks now with other people as well, is fine. It's, you know, I don't see much difference between this and if you and I were in a coffee shop talking, and you know, arguably there's a benefit to this because you don't have the distractions of the environment, you know. But if you and I were in the same room now, in a small room, just kind of sharing a cup of coffee, and or, well, one coffee each, and just having this conversation in physical person, I don't think there'd be much difference. Although it's nice to, you know, get together with friends, and so obviously there is a different social element. I mean, I have a small child she's doing her online schooling at the moment because the schools are closed, and it's very different for her to, you know, to not be able to play with her friends, you know, to not be able to run around and play with friends. I mean, there's a definite value to socializing and meeting in a common space, just on a social level, if not on an educational level in the formal sense.
But you see, it's interesting, and linking this to our sort of classroom approach and so on. I'm unsure if you've convinced me. Well, I'll say you haven't convinced me that there's a practical benefit to the classroom scenario, because what you've done there is explain that everything we would do in a classroom, and rightly so, again thinking of the themes of rebelling, not just seating people in a row 2 meters or whatever apart, and then just talking at them and hoping that they go away with more knowledge. I know you and I certainly agree, and hopefully your audience does or will agrees that that's not really the way that we should be focusing on education. So I am unsure what you're saying the benefit of being in the classroom is, because everything you've suggested to do there can be done online. So what's the...
But I think if you take it away from, as I said, this 2-person call that we're having now, which I think works almost perfectly. As I say, I think there's little distinction between this and if you and I were together, apart from the social value. I don't think, if the rest of human society had to be conducted through laptop screens, I think that would lead to a certain kind of derangement, socially speaking. So I think there is a kind of a social value to that kind of interaction. But that aside, this 2-person, this 2-way conversation is one thing. When you start getting up to larger numbers, and I think there's a benefit to collaborating in large numbers, not 50 or 100, but 10 people in a classroom, for example, then the dynamic of conversation, so in my experience, and I think I've worked pretty hard to facilitate as good collaboration as possible, but I think that the dynamic of conversation begins to falter when you're online because of, conversation necessarily involves a certain amount of interruption. People like to complain about interruption, like to do studies on, but you can't really have good natural conversation without some over-speaking and interruption. And it's that kind of thing just suffers a little bit online when you get up to, I don't know, more than even 4 or 5 people.
The only thing I find that misses suffers is if there is lag, and so in a number of years when everybody has 2,000 meg broadband or whatever, that should go. I think there is something. I think in the I'm teaching or training a group of people in a room, or I'm chairing a meeting, or all the other stuff I do. There are some things you can just notice somebody tapping their finger.
Exactly right. Yeah, right. Just a little twitch of a facial expression. Yeah.
I just want to go on to sort of, and this is a bit of a tangent, but it's linked to something you said about the lack of social interaction if they're all on their laptops and so on. Now, teaching is often talked about, and we know it isn't only about, and you and I have a great love of lifelong learning, but teaching is often looked at, the formative years of late primary, early mid, well, the whole of the secondary years. So we're talking 9 to 16, 17, 18. But a lot of those people are very used to, if we're going to make a big stereotype, over the last 10, 15 years, their whole thing is DMing each other. They're going on Instagram, they're going on Facebook, and they don't want to meet up in person because they find it easier to text each other. The phone has become a device to do everything apart from phoning each other on. So is it really not the world?
I don't know how true that is.
Not the world that the generation now.
I don't know how true that is. Again, it depends how far we kind of push the extremes. I don't know how true that is, because I kids do still hang out, and kids, the younger the kid, the more. But even 18, 19, they might spend more time on instant messages and social media, but they do spend a certain amount of that time arranging when they're going to meet, and they do still meet, and they do still go out. Social spaces do still get used, perhaps less than in the past. And now we actually can see this, in stark daylight. The schools being closed all around the world, one of the main things that most school-age kids are complaining about is not being able to see their friends. And of course, they do still have access to social media, but I'm hearing lots and lots of kids saying, I miss hanging out with friends.
Yeah, I can only speak for the reports I've seen and the people I've spoken to. I've only heard that complaints of the parents. Now, of course, there's.
I've definitely heard that from.
Okay,
from
that's
kids.
okay.
Yeah,
but just on, there's absolutely right that I had somebody who I work with who've had the kids at home, and they are with their wife as well, and they're saying they're really finding it a struggle, because whilst they're working at home during the pandemic, they're having to be a worker, they're also having to be a husband, and they're also having to be a parent and a teacher. And of course it's now you realise that it isn't as easy as you thought it was. But I think it's interesting because again they're looking at how we change the way we teach. I think I've seen some good examples of this, but they're very small. we're generally speaking missing a trick on. The use of people DMing and apps and all this sort of thing. What I see too much of in this country, because they're wanting to act like it's 1846, is that children will go into school, and some schools go so far as to take the phones off the children.
I was just, well, the first time I saw that out here, and I'm surprised you say that, because I thought that was an exclusively Indonesian
I find it so horrific. I find it I get that there's a time and place, and parents can get annoyed.
No, I actually don't, because
messaging at dinner, but use the app, use the phones, use the internet to create a new experience. Use the technology they're used to.
And I also think that
into the learning.
I don't like being with a person who is kind of glued to their phone for the entire time that we're together. I find that a problem socially as an adult now, with in a social situation. But I think that if we, and I think a lot of people would agree with that, and I also think that the people who are guilty of it would also agree with it, ironically. But I think that if we force the kids in school to not have any access to it, then they're not going to learn the social, they're not going to learn how to socialize around the devices. So they're going to leave the school and then they're going to be in a social situation that they haven't been prepared for. Well, how do I socialize without the device? Because I spent 8 hours a day, only knowing what to do without a device. Oh, one thing I should make clear as well, because I think I've perhaps not made it clear, although I endorse the return to the classroom, I do not necessarily endorse that should be 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. So I think that there is certainly a place for the physical classroom, but then I also support the idea of libraries, for example. Having a physical space to go and learn with other people around you, I think is a valuable thing to have, and I would not like to see that completely disappear. But to have kids, the bell rings and they must be in class from this time to this time, 8 hours a day, and in the same chair, that I definitely don't think is something we should be striving to get back to. If we could have the school building as a place that the kids are encouraged to come X number of times a week, which may or may not be more or less flexible, come in, okay, look, we're going to be doing a project on this particular day, and I want everybody in for an hour and a half on that day, and we'll do something together then. So it's kind of a central hub for learning, rather than the only place that learning is allowed to happen. And then I think there's some value to that.
But you see, what you're actually arguing for there is the system, certainly in this country, we have of how universities work. Now, there are those of us that argue that there are many 3-year courses that could be 2 years and so on. But the idea that you come in to do a particular thing, now, we would agree, as I think we have done on this call, that the thing that you're coming in to do is to sit in a hall of 100 people and listen to a lecture going on at you. That's not very constructive. But the idea is that you come in to do something, and then you mill around with people, and you go to the library, the university. So it's interesting, isn't it? Because the universities that are institutionally in this country even older than secondary primary schools in how they work, but they kind of have a model that we think could work if only if they could do it properly, or if they could only do it better. Yeah. And I think, but even when we start to, going back to early years, I often talk about the Scandinavian model, Finland, Norway, and how formal education doesn't start until 7, which I think is a great opportunity. In this country, where I think, I don't know if regressing is the right word, but we're pushing now formalized education and lessons earlier and earlier and earlier. But before the pandemic, because our whole school system is set up around a social model of mum and dad or carer or whoever needs to get their child to school at 7 in the morning so they can get to work their day, and then pick them up at 7.
Yes, right.
But the problem with that is not only are children in that environment for longer, we're also in this country, I think, going the wrong direction, because we're trying to come up with more formalized lessons. And when you have SATs at 9-10-year-old, I think is such the wrong way to go. And we're trying to, the problem is that now we have children in school or school settings or educational settings for much longer. We're trying to formalize the education a lot more, when I think we should be going in the other direction. So I think there's even a problem in how we structure the time people have, which really you've just commented on.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, the irony there is there are two things here that we're picking up from the university model. One of them that we again, maybe I should speak for myself, one of them that I like and one of them that I don't like. So I like the independence that we expect to see in the university model. I like the variety of activities. So, you can come to a lab session at a particular time with your classmates, and something is happening there that, there's a benefit to you being there. And then after that period is finished, you can go back to kind of your own approach, go to the library, or, go not to the library. You go and do things your own way. So that I like, and I'd like to see more of that in school. But unfortunately at the moment, the way that school is, or what schools seem to be taking from the university model, they are copying the university, but they're copying the fact that it's academically focused. And this brings us back to, something you mentioned earlier about this dichotomy between academic and vocational. I think there'd be a lot of value to maybe having a conversation about exclusively that, perhaps on a future podcast.
Yeah.
But even within this context, the vocational side of things, I think, is just the application of the learning. So the academic, for me, when we talk about academic, we mean learning for the sake of learning, right? Learning for the sake of amassing more knowledge. That's what sort of the academic approach is, which I think there's some value to in some contexts. The vocational side of things is this bit that's about preparing students with skills that they're going to be able to apply, whether that's in work or not. As you said, I don't think work should be the only thing we're thinking about. But it is a major goal, of course. So if we were to keep the flexibility of the university, but remove the exclusive focus on academic development, academic learning, and maintain some of the early childhood play that you'd get in the if you take the play aspect from early childhood and the flexibility from university and combine them in the middle school time frame, then I think you'd have something quite worthwhile.
I think it's interesting as well in terms of the, what would we do in the vocational side? Because we often talk about vocational, I'm going back to the Stone Age now, when I was at school, and it was either something to do with food or something to do with metal and wood.
Right,
You kind of
right.
did one or the other. And one of the good things about that now is we're kind of breaking through gender and sex barriers, because it was predominantly women doing this and men doing this, because that's what they thought they had to do. We have now this great thing of STEM. I think that's a bit limited because it misses out the arts and humanities, but we accept now that should be applicable to young women and young men, and regardless of their background. So I think we've made some benefits, we've made some sort of strides forwards there, but I think we're still missing a trick that we don't do any financial education to young teenagers. What is it to handle money? What is it to run a surplus, or at least break even every month and put a bit away?
So that's where, if you look at, if you use that example and we refer to maths, then that's where maths has been treated as a solely academic subject, right? By which I mean you learn formulas so that the whole purpose of maths is so that you know how to do mathematics. It's not so that you can do anything with it. And as far as I'm concerned, that just learning how to calculate your taxes, or work out how the interest on a mortgage, and these various things that people actually need to be able to do, that is then bringing vocation into maths. And beyond that, if you can look at how it applies to the workplace and whatever else, that would be vocation.
The number of people in their late teens, early 20s that have said to me, when am I ever going to use Pythagoras' theorem? So, but I mean, it's not even maths that's the problem, is it? I think we do too much maths. We don't do enough numeracy. We don't do too much English. We don't do enough literacy. And I think what we should be doing with with numeracy and literacy is threading them through everything else. So, and just linking it back to the vocational. So yes, learning, what is a mortgage and how would you apply for it? Or what's the difference between a mortgage and a rent? Housing for young people in this country, and I know other countries, is such a massive problem, but we don't even tell them in school, well, what's the difference between the different types of housing and how you apply?
And even when, you say that, like we said earlier, and we've already kind of pulled this apart a little bit, the idea that school is to prepare you or to get you a job. It doesn't prepare you. That I think is the problem. It's designed to get you the grades that will get you the job, but it doesn't really prepare you for the job. I mean, one way that's obviously true is you don't spend any real time in work learning what the workplace is going to be like. right? You do the study, which is academic study for the sake of getting the grade. The grade is for the sake of getting the job. Then the job starts, and you've got no idea what day one is going to be like. You've not spent any real time thinking about the job and the workplace and the relationships and the environment. Is an abstract, mysterious concept that is for the adults. Oh, well, that's for that's not for school.
There are those that would challenge you, of course, and say, but we have 2 weeks of work experience when one is 15. Because what happens with that?
Which I remember spending most of my time with my, whoever the person I was assigned to. She was a massive fan of Neighbours, and we spent most of our time watching Neighbours in the break room. I didn't get any value really from
Oh dear, watch out for bouncer. But I think the problem you've got is that those people go for 2 weeks. What is that 2 weeks? That certainly in my experience and everyone else's, you go there, there's no structure to it. The people at the workplace find it
they're not educators, right? So my case was, it was a junior member of the place I was working. She, not to say she wasn't good at her job, but she was not broadly across the entire institution. She was a fairly junior member, and I was shadowing her. She wasn't an educator. She wasn't. She wasn't in the heart of the institution.
But the school, in my experience, for me, but also in the experience I have of talking to other schools, they then don't try to structure a plan. In many cases, I have a few examples where that differs. They don't try to structure a plan, so that person goes in and staples and photocopies for 2 weeks, which doesn't, it puts them off work.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
And but we go back to this idea about work. I'm radical enough, rebellious enough. I am such a rebel that I say getting a job out of education is a side effect.
Yeah.
It's not even a fundamental principle of the purpose of education. It's a brilliant side effect, and one that we want to work towards and have them for. But really what we want them to do is go out into the world with such a, if I dare use the cliche, rounded education, that they have a knowledge of things like, how do I apply to get a mortgage? How do I go for a job interview? How do I form relationships?
That's it. Because I think I would.
We don't do enough on that.
Yeah, I think we'll probably end up agreeing, but I think I'll disagree with the way you've perhaps described that position. Okay, so I would agree that the getting a job should perhaps not be the be all and end all. I definitely agree with that. But I do think getting a job on at least some level, which I explore a little bit, should be a primary objective for what education is. Because, you talked about getting a house, for example. Well, you're not getting a house without gainful employment where you're earning money, right? We know that everybody needs to get a job. And so one of the things that we should be doing as teachers and as an education system is preparing people so that they will be, able to have effectively a comfortable life. Now, I have to remember what my 5 were, and I want to expand it more. But I kind of put forth a while back sort of 5 spheres of life that we operate in. One being, so professional, social. I forget what they were, and I wouldn't want to be too hardline on these are the 5, because it's just a kind of a loose idea that I had. But your professional life is an important part of adult life. Having a job, keeping a job, earning money so that you can have a house and feed yourself and things. We know that these are necessary. But what I disagree with is, as we've said before, the way that the concept of work is idealized at the school level. It's just this thing, you need to get the grade so you can get the job. If we could spend more time identifying the skills and the strengths and the interests that children have, and then kind of transitioning, if anything, just transitioning from, okay, today, the way it is now is like, today you're in school for 12 years, and then you take an exam, and then adult life starts and you're in a job, and there's a wall between the two, apart from this 2 weeks of work experience that you've mentioned. But if we could kind of just crossfade, as it were, the school experience, and then you kind of maybe you dip your toe into a few different working environments, and you learn not just from your teachers but maybe from leaders in different environments, and then gradually you're just transitioning to a point where you are now in the world of work. So interestingly, I liked, I'll have to read more about, or you'll have to send me the link again about those different
parts of your life. I mean, I think of a podcast, whose spheres are they anyway? But it's an interesting approach, because we've identified, I think, certainly on this podcast amongst the two of us, is that I like the idea of the transition, but that we're accepting that the world of education doesn't match the worlds of work. So it's almost like, I do still believe that the side, getting a job is a side effect of education. But if the education system is good, of a good quality, the side effect is a natural happening. But
I agree with you there.
It isn't about getting a job, is it? It is about applying for jobs, plural.
Yes.
So,
of course,
the education system doesn't guarantee you'll get a job, because there's still too much, certainly in this country, of, if mummy or daddy have the right money or the right connections, and they can get you into the right college and get you into the right workplace. And so in general, it's about equipping young people for the confidence in applying for jobs. And in the case, I have somebody I know in their mid-20s, they literally applied for 300 job positions, didn't get any of them. So they're sort of currently floating around retail, which has now become almost impossible. It's about, how do we build in, let's bring in the word of the day, resilience. I have a bit of an issue of how, we think we give people resilience training and they are resilient. Well, no, they're slightly more resilient than they were before. But, especially around the world of mental health that we talk about these days, the education system that we have, certainly in this country, is so detrimental to the mental health of young people that when they become 16, 18, we say, right, now go out and get a job with all the confidence in the world and make, but by the age of mid-20s, we socially expect you to have a car and a family and a house and a dog. There's just too much put onto young people, isn't it? And
no, it definitely is. I mean, I would say perhaps then let's see if I can reformulate my position, and because I think we're agreeing.
Yes.
So I definitely, confidence to apply for jobs and the resilience of all of that, so dealing with the job market, as it were, and all of those things is overlooked and should be incorporated. I agree. But again, schooling should be about developing the whole child. Let's kind of that's a common, I think, popular phrase at the moment, the holistic approach to approach to developing the whole child. And it should have more interest than it generally does now in the personality and developing the character. These are things that I think are neglected. They get a lot of lip service, so I think a lot of people will disagree with me. I get a lot of people say, oh no, you're talking about an old form of education that's long gone. Now the curriculum includes this. It does on paper, but it doesn't in the classroom. So I think that these are things that definitely need to be built in more than they are now. But whilst we're developing that whole child and we're building their personality, we do also need to be aware of the needs of the job market, not in the corporate sense, but in the the world needs productive people, not just to sit on the production line. There are problems that need solving. There are things that the world needs to function. And we need to make sure that, to some degree, we're graduating children who will become adults who have the competencies that we all need. I need, I need police officers, and I need doctors, and I need, I want people to run restaurants so that I can go, and I need actors. I mean, these are the things that we need for our life to, and you'll notice that, I'm talking about not just the high levels like doctors and lawyers, but I need taxi drivers, I want bus drivers, I want the world to have these things in it. This is the world that we want to perpetuate. And so we need to have, as educators and as an education system, we need to have some awareness of the competencies that broad spectrum of life requires, and we need in some way to make sure that we're developing those into whatever this whole child is. It needs to, we need to be quite acutely aware of the work goal, I think.
And I think, and of course, we need many more teachers, which the one thing in this country we're doing very good at the moment is pushing teachers out of the profession.
Yeah, that's it.
Because of the stresses we're putting them under, and the unreasonable
numbers reduce.
The unreasonable expectations we're putting them under. And then the social issues of, well, what's the problem with being a teacher? You finish at 3 o'clock with the students, don't you?
You get summers off, you get 6 weeks off in the summer, and
6 weeks off, you have to do anything. I still think, I mean, if we bring it bang up to date with the relevance, we're now asking people to spend more time at home if their job allows it, to be more remote working and so on. Certainly the company I happen to work for has made quite a big statement globally to all of its global workforce that they should consider, you know, between 2 and 3 days a week, or maybe all of the days a week, not coming into the office. Now, you know, from a business perspective, that helps reduce cost of businesses environmentally. There's less of a carbon footprint with, so there's lots of benefits to it. But it kind of, again, is changing the world of work, because we're asking children to go into classrooms, which we've discussed various problems with on here. But then really, if they're looking up to, I mean, let's say the people who are being teenagers in this decade now, they're seeing their parents work at home for more often. So they're thinking, surely, well, why am I having to go into a fixed location to do this thing called education when my parents are making money at home and not having to leave their home office much? So I really think, you know, the approach that we can take now, and this is where I think the rebellious nature of how education is going to change is almost going to become, automatic's the wrong word, but it's going to have to come, is that we're going to see that we can't send children back. I mean, they're going back at the moment in some cases, but when the parents are spending more time at home doing work, and when you see, their lives are going to change, because whether they can take their kids to school or pick them up at the same time is going to change. And all of this is changing. So we're going to, I think, have to see a radical change in the world of education. I think go right back to what my opening statement, as it were, was that all the teachers we talk to are already rebels, in that we want to change the system and we don't agree that fixed exams are the best way to assess people and so on. Yet, because we're trying to hold on to that socially and in education, it's a bit of a massive rhetorical question of how on earth do we we should be taking the opportunity to reshape society, to reshape the education system. But if you and I are true, or have some truth in what we've said about socially, we're trying to make the world go back a little bit to how it was, knowing that we can't ever be that way again fully. We're also doing the same with education. So I suppose the challenge for us as teachers and trainers and whatever, how do we get those teachers that do want to rebel and that do want to change it, but are stuck in the world they are? How do we bring them out of their shell?
I mean, there's a couple of things that come to mind straight away that are, you know, there's small enough changes that a teacher has the flexibility to do them relatively privately, right, without raising too many askant glances, but that they would be getting some results from, so that then, you know, when the time comes, you'd be able to say, hey, look at this thing I've been doing, why can't we do more of this? And at the moment, that does not, unfortunately, extend to the big questions like exams, right? So the exams are out of, you know, as a classroom teacher, that's out of my control. And there are some things that I have to be cautious about as a classroom teacher, as a, you know, a rebel teacher who wants to push these boundaries and try new things. I do have to think of my students' position where I could rebel against the exams, but then my students would all fail their exams, and that would be my fault. And you know, so there's an element there where I've got to restrain some of my ideology, because as long as the system is the way it is, I could push back against it, but I wouldn't be the one that ends up suffering. So there's some area there where we have to just be considerate. There are some things that the idea of sort of asynchronous learning and the idea of the learning space, the classroom space. I mean, there's nothing to prevent you as a teacher when your students come into the classroom. Okay, so let's say we all go back to school because the schools are open and the government says you've got to, you know, attend class. Okay, but there's no reason why, whilst you're in the class, you still have to format it in that kind of lecture-driven, you know, rows based. There's nothing to say that you can't push the tables to the side and get the kids, you know, kind of sitting more freely, remove the teacher from the front of the room, and as a teacher position myself either in the midst of the students or at the back of the classroom. There's no reason that we can't get the kids to go out to the library or go out to the playground, the yard, you know, whatever, and learn in more. There's all of these things that you can do that are radical in the sense that it's different from the traditional model, but you're not breaking any rules, right? You can do a lot within the kind of the codified rules, because they're really, as rigid as they are, they're so short-sighted, they're quite easy to get around. You say, well, look, we're in school, we're here in the right hours, we're doing but we don't need to be all sitting facing one way, watching the teacher explain something on the whiteboard for a, for a score. I don't need to give a quiz every time I want to get a score. Okay, I have to, I would like to get rid of scores. And again, I think we can probably have a good podcast in the future where we just talk about grades and scores. I would like to get rid of grades and scores, but I can't, because if I stop giving my students grades and scores, then they're going to suffer. But I don't have to get those scores from a multiple choice quiz. I can get those scores from wherever I choose. And so there's a lot of room, I think.
There's a big education program there explaining to the outside world why, in my view, qualitative data is much more rich, beneficial than quantitative. But again, as you rightly say, we're kind of stuck with that. Well, if you don't have a B, you can't come in here. So what does it matter whether you've got a 300-word testimonial from your teacher saying what a wonderful person you are? I need that B. So yeah, we've got a challenge there. I think interesting as well. I want to pick up on something you said there, which has challenged something I've said during this call. When you're saying actually about whether the teacher's here or here and how they interact with the classroom, it reminds me of that wonderful debate that, is a teacher really a teacher, or should they be a facilitator? But let's park that for now, because that's a longer conversation. What I think is interesting is here I am saying, well, let's rail against the system and look at how people work from home and look at how we do more stuff online. Yeah, what are we doing online? We're still having a group of people come together. We're still having one person as the teacher leading it. We're making sure that the apps we use, like Zoom and others, have breakout rooms, because we do breakout sessions in a classroom. So here I am saying, let's rebel against the system and use this new technology, when all we've done is design the technology, and we want to use the technology the way we already operate in the physical classroom. So there's a disconnect there, isn't there, in saying.
But again, I think there are, as I said, there are some benefits. There are things, like I mentioned before, some of the reasons I want to get back to the classroom, because there are things that I think benefit from that. But as you've pushed me back on that, and I think you've nudged me farther along. But for me, a lot of that is just about how good is the technology, because I think there are things that we get from being in the classroom that I don't want to lose, the collaboration and various other things. But as long as the technology,
are of the classroom.
Well, I think that I still think that being in a room with other people physically, the flow of communication and collaboration is, I think, easier to achieve. But that's only really a case of, well, how good can the technology get? If the technology can overcome what I think interrupts or hinders that flow of collaboration, as long as the technology can continue to increase, then less and less will we need to be in the classroom to achieve the things that I think the classroom is good for.
Would you and I, actually, you've cleverly, I was going to say, would you and I have had a better debate face to face, but you've cleverly kind of pushed that away, because you've already said you think 2 works well.
Yeah, I just
more than 2. So, I mean, I suppose there's a question why, but if there was a third person here, and I know I'm now trying to do a hypothetical, but if there was a third person here, I can't see, and I appreciate the answer. The simple answer is, well, we'd have to do it and see. I can't see what we'd majorly lose and how we would have any less of the quality.
Yeah, I mean, I think even though that's the position I'm holding, I think I probably will find it difficult to really nail down in black and white terms. But having had the experience of, so I've done webinars where you've got anything between 40 and a few hundred people on a video conference, which means it is just me speaking while people listen. It could be a YouTube video. It doesn't.
How didactic of you?
It was, it was something I didn't enjoy doing, and I don't really want to do again. A number of the events that I would have done live moved online, and the event organizer said, "Oh, we're doing it online now." Yeah, sure, okay. Didn't enjoy it. Don't want to do it again. But I've also had the experience of doing training programs where it's 4, 5, 6 people, and there I have found that it's just not quite the same. It's just not quite as fluid online as it is in the classroom. However, what I can't speak to, but I can assume, if that my courses, that the courses that I do at the moment, they're sort of 4-week courses, and definitely there's already more of this kind of social fluency by the end of the 4 weeks than there is at the beginning of the 4 weeks. So it might just be the case that we all just need to get more used to what it's like to be online.
Fluency, sorry. How do you?
There's this idea of, as I said, a conversation or a collaborative group in the classroom or in a room. You put 5 people in a room together in a physical space where they're sharing that physical space. There's a closeness, and ask them to collaborate, ask them to communicate and have a conversation. That versus trying to achieve the same thing through a 5-way Zoom call, for example. Okay, 5 people, I want you to, essentially, you have a goal, I want you to achieve this goal, build this thing, do this thing, whatever. There are 5 people in a space together or 5 people online from different places. The flow of communication, in my experience, is somewhat hindered. It's somewhat less fluid, somewhat less, somewhat less smooth online than it is when they're in a physical space. It doesn't have to be a classroom. It can be 5 people in a bar, but I suspect that might just be because people haven't got used to doing it online yet. So maybe...
There's an element. Would you not say, though, that is it not the same online as it is in person in the fundamentals, that at the start nobody really talks to each other?
Yeah, definitely.
Then the few people who speak for myself, the few people have a big mouth, can start to talk a bit more confidently. Then by the tea break, as we would have traditionally, they will talk a bit more, and when they come back, and then by the end of the first day, they're all talking to each other and asking about their family. So I mean, I think the fundamentals are perhaps...
I mean, just even something like, let's use the breakout rooms as an example. I love the breakout room feature that Zoom has and some of the others have. So if I'm in a classroom and I've got, say, 10 students in a classroom, there will be times where I am the teacher and I'll stand up and share something with the students. I'll tell them, I'll explain something to them. As much as I endorse and promote student-centered learning, I do think that there is a place for the teacher to be standing in front of students. I'm going to, stick to that. But then I might say, okay, after this couple of minute period where I'm standing at the front of the room, then I'll put them into groups and go, okay, so I want you to get into 3 groups or whatever, and they'll do that, and then they'll work in their groups. Now you can do that with breakout rooms, but with breakout rooms, it's okay. Now just wait a minute while I click on these buttons, and there's just a it's less fluid because of the. But that could just. I think that's just a case of, well, the technology will continue to improve, and we'll continue to get more skilled at it. So maybe it's just the fact that we need to learn how to do that better.
I would agree, but I've experienced that. How would I explain it? That kind of staccato approach to breakouts, in that, I've gone, right, okay, the classic, right, you've all got a flip chart pad and 3 different color pens. I want you to do this and this. And then one of the groups says, oh, Lee, I haven't got a blue pen, or Lee, I haven't got a flip chart pad. So I've got to run out, I've got to stop, I've got to fiddle around. So the sort of, the vagaries are still there. They're just... I mean,
even that, so just there. So say we're online, or let's say we're in the classroom, the student says, oh, just for argument's sake, my pen's run out, right? Whatever, just something like, oh, my pen's run out, my pencil's broken. If I'm there, I mean, this is a really trivial example, but I think it carries some weight. If I'm there, or if we've got 10 people in a room, and one of the students says, my pen's run out, then one of the other 9 people will say, oh, you can borrow mine. And if you're in a room, just as a really trivial example, if I'm here and I've got a pen and it runs out and I don't have another pen, and I also don't have 10 other people who could, it's just something like that. It seems to me there's a benefit to, that's a really trivial example that just comes to mind.
But nobody else online can click your button for you.
Right.
Yeah, I think so.
I don't think that's a good enough reason to say, oh, we must go back to school in case somebody's pen runs out. Now, granted, but I think there's something to this idea of a pooled resource, a shared space. You can all be looking at a PDF or a document or something on your respective laptops, right? So the idea of shared reading can still be done. But if you're all in a classroom, then it's just easier for you to go, oh, look at this bit, and to point at a bit of the page where where we're all there together, and we can very quickly all draw the entire group's attention to one thing and say, look at me, look at this. You can point to something. All of these things you can't quite do in the same way. So if you're all collaborating, I just think there's the online platform adds a certain barrier between to the flow of work, or the flow of collaboration, let's say. Where, like I say, if it's a case of just sharing something, sharing an idea, it's quicker perhaps for me to just kind of point to something than it is for me to have to upload it and send it to you. Again, the technology can improve, and all of that can lubricate as the technology improves. I just feel like maybe right now we're not quite there yet, where the technology is absolutely facilitating. But there are massive benefits to the technology that you don't get from the classroom. So I'm not saying, I'm absolutely not saying I want to go back to the way things were. Definitely not. Well, I think there are some benefits to the classroom.
But I think it's interesting because you're right that we haven't quite got there yet, and we haven't learned how to do it properly. But that's because we've only had 6 months doing it, really.
Yeah, definitely.
Or less, because there was that lull at the start. We didn't know where it was. I remember speaking to people in May going, "Oh, we'll be back to normal on the 1st of June." So see how that turned out. So, and I think, it's interesting though, because if I just sort of think of the approach of rebelliousness, the Rebel Teacher Network, and you rightly say that we all do little rebellious things in our day, in our week, in our month, and we slip them in without some people noticing. Sometimes that might be ourselves that don't notice, and we do things like that. I get all that, but at the same time, we've with slight differences on approach, and I may think that the online world, isn't actually as different, and it hasn't limited our social contact as much as we think. That will be, of course, be the subject of much research to come, which will be fascinating to see over the next 5-10 years. But with all of that in mind, we've generally agreed that, of course, there's a benefit to the classroom, and of course, there's a benefit to the in-person interaction, and I think one could argue that the thing that you feel, the gut feel, that you're explaining something to somebody and they're going, yeah, I get it. And when you're stood next to them, there's almost that sixth sense of you feel that they're not really getting it. So you can't quite pick that up. And what we're doing, however, without any negative reason, is we're kind of arguing, though, that the classroom works quite well, which we can agree on, and there's benefits to it. So what are we actually rebelling against? What is it we want to?
Yeah, well, I think it's important. I think it's important when I talk about rebellion. In the article that I read on the last episode, one of the things that I referred to was the distinction, as I draw them, between rebellion and revolution. So I think, I'm calling for something quite different in a rebellion than a revolution, where a revolution is raise it to the ground, right? Now, I don't necessarily think that everything has to go. I think that radical change is necessary, but I think that there are things that are good. There are things that work, but they are shrouded in so many things that don't work, that, we're losing a lot of the benefit that we could be having in the way school is now. I think that, when we're talking about the way school is now, the physical classroom is only one part of that. We're talking about curriculum, we're talking about teacher development, we're talking about assessment and examination, all of these things that make up the system. The physical classroom is one part of it, and that's been the focus of our conversation today. I think there's a lot of other things we can come to in future conversations. We look at other aspects of the system. The physical classroom is one of those aspects, and so rebelling in the context of the physical classroom could just be as much can you still hear me? I think my mic's gone. Could just be as much as getting out of the classroom occasionally, go to the library, go outside, take students from two classrooms and put them together, various things that even that's still happening sort of in the context of the physical classroom. So it's just, the case that you get in the most traditional of schools at the moment is just really kind of rigid. In the bell rings, it's period 1, and that means you have to be sitting in this chair in this room with this teacher for 90 minutes. That's the model. So how much of that do we want to keep, and how much of that do we want to change? And we might want to change all of it. We might want to drop the entire thing, or we might see some nuggets of value in that that we want to keep while we try to do something new. And if one teacher decides, okay, instead of that, I'm just going to take the kids outside or take the students outside, and they can work in the playground. As long as it's sunny, we can go outside, and they can, or, you know, instead of everybody sitting at their table, if you want to sit on the floor, you know, I just like to let my students sit where they want to sit, for example. You know, if they want to move their chair somewhere, if they want to sit in the corner, if they want to sit on the floor, if they want to push their tables together or pull, I'm happy to let them do that. Now that sounds perhaps insignificant, but it's enough of a rebellion, I think, in terms of, well, when I'm doing that in one of my schools, and granted, here in Indonesia, the schools I'm working in are generally perhaps even more formal than some of the schools that you'll be working around in the UK. But when I'm in a school and I'm doing that, I'm the only teacher doing that in the only classroom that's happening out of, you know, 50 other classrooms. So that is enough of a break from the norm that the students are having a different experience in my classroom, and they're getting a benefit in my classroom that they're not getting in other classrooms. And for, you know, so something small like that. And then what I found is, you know, the students enjoy being in my classroom, in my lessons, more than they enjoy being in the next teachers. And so the students get on board with it, and then they start to take some of their behavior that they're picking up in my classroom, and you see them starting to do it in other classrooms. And some of the teachers will not like it, and some of the teachers will push back against it, and they'll reprimand the students for but eventually, you know, if there's 50 teachers in a school, a small handful of those will start to see what I'm doing, either because they see me doing it or because they get some kind of feedback from the students, and they'll start to change as well. And you start to see this change kind of rippling throughout the institution in a meaningful way, and that's perhaps enough that something is happening that is benefiting the students.
I absolutely agree, and I'm just trying to sort of pull some threads together of what we've been talking about here, and I agree with you. There's so many jumping off points that we could launch into, and hopefully so in future conversations. You know, major problems I have, you know, I would like to see the end of league tables. I would like to see the end, well, a change to, or preferably the scrapping of our inspection system, Ofsted, and create a new body that does look at the teaching practice, but also considers the well-being of both students and the teachers. Quite a radical thing for Ofsted to consider. So we've got so many different things of it, but I think examinations in most, you know, there's a place for them, but in most cases they're not fit for purpose. I think that the way that we structure the hierarchy, stratifying all the different you know, levels, classes 1 to 5 of maths and 1 to 5 of English, based on some nebulous idea of talent or skill that nobody can prove that they've scored. The idea of, you know, the league tables and the inspection system and the examinations and all of how universities work and so on, and all of that, I think, is needing change. The thing is, though, they are all such, as really we've talked about here, such fundamental parts of the system that if you were to remove or attack one of them, the rest of them all rely on it. So, for example, you couldn't just change the inspection system without changing how exams work. But if you change exams or get rid of a number of them, you couldn't have league tables. If you don't have league tables, that in this country, that eliminates the ability for government to work out funding. And so I think is the problem we've got, I suppose, mainly for me as a final thought for this particular talk, are all of those things which a lot of the people, you and I talk about, a lot of the teachers I talk to would like to see the end of, or at least a radical shake-up, are they such fundamental core principles of the education system we have that do we have to somehow accept they're not going to change, and therefore all we can do, not negating the importance of it at all and the kind of things you've been talking about, are we limited to the kind of things you've done and lots of other teachers do, of playing around in the existing system, believing that really we can't change the system itself? Do we have to accept that?
Yeah, I think I certainly hope not. And I think that there's maybe a number of pillars that we've kind of referred to there, examinations and various other things that might warrant some, you know, examination in yeah, right, in their own separate conversations. And I think we can have, you know, lengthy conversation about each of them and see what the limitations are in each area. But I think that they can be attacked separately. And I think that you might find that there are limits in each area. So, for, you can do more and more about how you approach examinations within the current system. But at some point, well, the kid has to sit the exam. Okay, so there's a limit there. But I think there's more room than a lot of teachers feel there is. I think that's the first thing to point out. I mean, is that I know I do more than a lot of the teachers that I work with, and even the teachers that I talk with online who are located globally, because they feel that they can't. I know I do more than most, not because there's anything special about me, but because this is what I've chosen to do. I mean, the fact that's why I've started the podcast. That's why I'm starting the network. I am somebody who's kind of active in this area, and so I am some form of evidence that you can do more than you're probably doing now, right? Not to denigrate anybody who's not, but it's just, I think you can get away with more than you think. You can do more than you think, and small changes can have bigger impacts on the students than you think. So getting started, taking those first smaller steps, I think is important, and realizing that you can do more than you might feel like you can do. Teachers often feel very, very stifled in their institutions. They feel like they can do nothing different, and I think you can do more than is realized. And then I think that once more teachers realize that, I think there will be a snowballing effect. I just think that it's so hard to believe that could be the case, that, well, why bother starting? But if you can just bother to start, then I think some motion can be picked up, and we might find a brick wall, but if we get enough speed, maybe we can break through the brick wall. Who knows?
Exactly. The more people you have, without wanting to abuse the metaphor, the easier the wall will go down. But I just think, we've touched briefly on earlier in this call, the civil rights movements that have gone on before us and now, and more power to them. The trade unions that have struggled for years. It's actually the people within the profession itself that empower each other in order to make that change, isn't it? So I suppose what a wonderful inspirational message that is to all of the teachers, that we need to challenge each other. And by challenging each other, we'll improve our own practice, but we need to challenge each other to challenge the system as a whole, because the more people that sit back and say, well, actually, I can't really change it, well, of course, you're not going to change it because you've already decided that you can't.
Exactly.
I think it is very much about empowering each other and making sure that we can do that. And little changes, as you rightly say, in your own practice will not only help improve your practice and improve the outcomes of your learners, but collectively that will give you a sense of, well, actually, I thought I could do this, but today I've made this change and I've done something differently. And so definitely about empowering each other. But I am sure you will tell everyone, rightly so, that's what the whole purpose of the network is.
Exactly right. And also, I mean, just to close there then, there's a lot of kind of grandiosity around that, and I believe in it. That's why I'm starting the network, as you say, that I wouldn't have bothered if I didn't think. So I'm hoping that, we can get more and more people engaged with this network and spanning out of it. But also, even without, setting our sights on those high, lofty goals, it's also, I think, very important as we close here to just leave with the reminder that if you, as one teacher, make one of those small changes that means you're doing a better job as a teacher and you're providing some benefit to the students in your classroom, if the student doesn't nudge 1 inch, then at least the 20 or 30 kids in your classroom are getting something better out of it. And they're going to, their experience is going to be better than if you didn't make that change. And if that's the only thing that comes of it, well, then something has come of it. And for those 30 kids, and, if you teach 30 kids in one grade and you've got X grades a year, one teacher, I think potentially in a career, if you're a career teacher and you're teaching for 10, 20, 30 years, then you potentially interact with, several thousand students throughout your career. And I don't think it's insignificant to say that if you can improve the outcomes of education for 1,000 children, then I don't think that's insignificant, right?
Absolutely.
All right, so I think that's a good, positive place to end. And hopefully there'll be more of this to come. Thanks a lot, Lee, for doing this with me. Indeed.
Power to the students.
Yes, and yeah, I think that's the other thing is, you know, I work with teachers and I talk a lot about teachers, and I'm trying, but why? Well, because it's the students, it's the end goal, right? The more we
That's
do
why
with
we get out of
teachers,
bed.
exactly right,
Yeah,
exactly right.
absolutely.
All right, brilliant. Well, thank you. Anybody who's watching
Thanks for
this,
having me.
hope you'll be back with us when we do this next time. And please like and subscribe to the YouTube channel that you're watching this on. And there's going to be a lot of developments in the future, I think, that will be valuable for any teachers who are watching. Thanks a lot, Lee. And,
Thank you.
yeah, speak to you again soon.